I'll plunge right into these stuff. We are doing, as you know, a series this year called The Ben-Gurion Era at High Noon, Israel and the Jews. Israel and the Jews, 1957 to 1961. As you see as we proceed, I'm referring to this as the Ben-Gurion Era at High Noon for deliberately, and you'll see more of it as we proceed. Tonight we're doing the second lecture of the series, which is entitled Sneaking into an Exclusive Club. I repeat, Sneaking into an Exclusive Club, Israel and the Bomb, 57 to 61, Part 1. And we start tonight by talking about the bomb, okay? And of course, we all know that this is a subject that starts with this, right? Here is a little bit of the map across the United States of America of the Manhattan Project. Everybody knows it was a gargantuan project, okay? The government at that time spent billions when a billion was once upon a time a lot of money. I'm talking about in World War II, and this is not the whole map. This is part of the United States. They had plants and production things they had to do all over the place. It wasn't just Robert Oppenheimer and 3 or 4 Jews in a room, came up with the bomb. It was a whole huge network, and it was done American style. No other country could have done it, which is to put this on a national basis and mobilize all the scientists and the labor force and this and the other. And at that time, it cost $2 billion, which was a lot of money once upon a time. And it was in complete secrecy, which is quite amazing, from everybody except Stalin. But, the Rosenbergs and all that, which is true. But everybody else didn't know about it, which is quite a story. Roosevelt was the one, Vannevar Bush came to him 2 months before Pearl Harbor, said, we got to do this. And Roosevelt said, let's do it, but just don't tell anybody. Take it to the research stage, and after that, talk to me. And of course, he said yes. Where do you get the money? This is how the things ran in those days. Roosevelt, let's put it this way, where do you put $2 billion? Said the German analysts can't see that you're putting the extra money into the federal budget, and they're saying, what's going on? Because that's what they do. They read the budget figures, don't they? So if this goes from the Army, there must be something $2 billion worth special that we don't know about, and that would send the spies looking for it. And so Roosevelt called in Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House. Once upon a time, he says, put $2 billion and don't tell anybody where it's going. And, actually, I said this wrong. He called General Marshall, and he said, you handle this, but don't tell anybody. General Marshall, George Marshall, was an iconic figure. He was like another George Washington. He had tremendous integrity, tremendous respect. And so he went to Speaker of the House. He said like this, you just have to trust me. I need $2 billion, and nobody should know where it's going. You know that I'm not using it from my own pocket. You know me, right? So I'm not using it from my own pocket, but you can't ask me any questions. You understand? You can't ask me where it's going. And Rayburn said, I guess, I trust you. It was America of yesteryear. This is not the America of the gridlock of today, right? I'm serious. This is quite a story. And Rayburn called in 15 committee heads in the House of Representatives, because that's where all the money bills start under our constitutional system. And he said, each one is going to put $100 million, and don't ask me where it's going. You're going to give the money to me, and you trust me or you don't. Same thing with Marshall. He said, either you think I'm putting it in my own pocket, or you know that it's going for something, but you can't ask any questions. And they say, yes, sir. This is America in 42. It's a different culture. And Truman had a committee to investigate where the money's going in the defense effort. That's how Truman became famous as a senator, and he heard about the Manhattan Project, and Sam Rayburn said like this, just shut up and don't ask me questions. I know where it's going, and don't investigate it. And Truman said, yes, sir. And they didn't investigate it. And this is how, one day, the whole public was surprised. Kablooey! They blew up Hiroshima, and nobody knew that it was happening. So I say this because you're going to consider the Israeli parallel or lack of parallels when it comes to something which is such a gargantuan project. I mean, it doesn't just happen by itself, but it happened under everybody's nose and nobody knew about it. When America got the bomb, it became, in fact, right in the middle of the war in 1943 or so, when it looked like we're really making progress, Roosevelt made the famous decision. He told Churchill at one of the meetings, we are not sharing this with anybody, even though the British are the ones who started the project. They're the first ones that came up with the idea and told the Americans about it, to be perfectly frank, and all the rest of it. But Roosevelt said, I think we're going to keep this to ourselves. And that's what happened, which is, again, an important part of our story. So in 1945, there was a grand total of 1 country that had the atomic bomb, okay? And as you know, Truman didn't ask anybody about dropping it. It's a decision he made himself. And nobody else in no other country, I mean, our British allies, the Russian allies, and the others, he said, you're not going to have any of this, okay? Now, once the war was over, the whole world itself was like sort of shocked and astonished at this revolution that now you have atomic energy and atomic bombs, and what do we do with this? And the intelligent scientists like Oppenheimer and the others said we should think about how to handle all this. So the government, Truman was very much a process type guy, so he set up a high-level committee, okay, called the Atchison Lilienthal Committee, which was run by the Undersecretary of State and the head of the TVA, a Jewish guy, Lilienthal. And this was a heavyweight committee, and Bernard Baruch was on it, and they discussed back and forth. They did shakavat nosim and notim, all the pluses and the minus and the minus and the pluses up and down. Should they share it? Should they give it to the United Nations? Should they give it to the Russians? This, that, and the other. And there were different opinions. Notice they had a full, total debate. And when it was all over, we're not sharing it with anybody, okay? So the end of the story is that only one country had the bomb until 1949, and then Stalin got it because the Rosenbergs and people like that gave it to him. They were electrocuted for doing it, but nevertheless, a whole bunch of spies cooperated from day one. Oppenheimer's brother was a communist, right? His girlfriend was members of the Communist Party. There was just a communist penetration of the Los Alamos and other projects. This is part of modern American post-war history, and get over it, okay? Now, England, so that means that between 1940, I'm just trying to show you, it wasn't everybody had the bomb. America had it, and then Russia had it. I might say that as soon as Russia got it, then Russia said, now let's go for the H-bomb. Then Truman said, then we got to go for the H-bomb, and that's what happened then. But no other countries had it, and they didn't give it out for Hanukkah gifts. England was pretty angry over this, because they said, listen, we're the ones who helped America, and British scientists, by the way, were very important. British scientists and Canadian scientists were very important in helping the Manhattan Project work and all that. Tough luck. And so England, 1947, said, we're going to get one too. And in 1952, Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister of England, said, we're going to get our own. And so they spend a lot of money. I want you to understand that if you're going for a bomb or anything like that, you're talking about spending billions, and that's not so pushy for a country. The United States, in World War II, when they have money going, the taxes were up to here and the money was coming in, so you can hear it. But, England was poor at that time after the Second World War, and nevertheless, they said we're going to spend the money and do it. And in 1952, they made their own A-bomb. So now you have 3 countries, but a grand total of only 3 countries in the world that have atomic bomb. Nobody else at all had it. Now, how do you get one? First of all, you got to have the brains, okay? So you need guys like that, who maybe you recall is Jewish, you see? Let's put it this way. Israel has brains. They had smart scientists. They had smart guys who did well in the science test. And Ben Gurion already from day one, literally from day one, is dreaming. Maybe we can get Einstein over here. He'll tell us how to make a bomb, okay? Take a look at this. He happens to visit Einstein at Princeton, just happens to be in 1951.
Prime Minister Ben Gurion of Israel arrives at Princeton, New Jersey to call on Dr. Albert Einstein, one of the world's greatest scientists, the father of relativity and the man whose physics formula led the way to the atomic explosion, plays host to the leader who played a great part in the creation of the Israeli nation. Here are 2 men, one whose imprint will be written deep in the history of social progress, and the other who helped found a new age, a meeting to remember.
Now, I can tell you right now, Ben Gurion was not interested in Einstein because of relativity. You understand? The way he thought was, boom, okay? Now, believe it or not, in 1949, that's right when Israel became a state, and they were broke, and the Ma'abarot, and they had all the refugees pouring in, and they were still fighting the Arabs. And he was already thinking about getting an atomic bomb, right? It's crazy, all right? But that's who Ben Gurion was. He said, I'm not crazy, I'm visionary. And the real reason is because he always was afraid of this phenomenon. Kemal Pasha was the great Turkish general who defeated the Italians, the British, and the Greeks and all that in the Turkish wars in the early 1920s. Meaning he was afraid the Arabs one day would get their act together and get a competent general. Now, fortunately, that has not happened, but he said it could, right? Remember, the British thought they were so great, and the Turks beat the pants off them at Gallipoli, you see? So he's always worried. He says, when will come the Arab Kemal Pasha? When will come a great Egyptian general, a great Syrian general, a great Iraqi general who organize the Arabs, and then we'll be in troubled hands. So we need the A-bomb. He never used these words, but you need the A-bomb as the backup plan. You understand? So he was already thinking about this, meaning he understood, obviously, what I've been pounding over here. Israel has terrible borders. They're tremendously vulnerable. The peace that they felt themselves compelled to sign under pressure from Truman and the United Nations, left Israel in a not very good military type position. Right now, the Arabs are weak, but who knows, right? Who knows? And therefore, without saying it, because he never said it, but without saying it, he wants a backup plan. You understand? He wants an option over here, as they say, and he went for it. So this is, I mean, you have to understand how incongruous this all is. It's like somebody living, it's like somebody making a small living and living in a 2-room apartment and, barely be able to meet his expenses, can't afford to take a vacation, but he drives a Rolls Royce. You understand? Here's Israel, broke, begging. They were going to the period of, this is what's going on in Israel, the Ma'abara, as we saw, Salah Shabbati. They can't even have enough to make food on the table. They're living literally from handouts from the American Jews, from the U.S. government, and from money from Israel. And he's dreaming of a Rolls Royce, right? He's dreaming of a Manhattan Project. We've got billions of it. Like, where are you going to do it for? He said, I guess, don't let facts get in the way. You understand? Because you won't be a visionary if you think like that. You have to think in the big plan over here. Now, the Yetzer Hara over here, the guy who was always telling him we can do it, is a person who's not very well known today, but was a big kachlefel, a big scientist once upon a time in Israel in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. And this is Professor Bergman, Ernst David Bergman, whose father was a conservative rabbi in Berlin. His father went to the Vienna Seminary and was like, put it this way, his father was a conservative Jewish, no, it was a Zionist rabbi. And, they, were very traditionalistic and all that sort of thing. And this guy grew up in Berlin, therefore. And therefore, he was very smart in science. And already in the 20s, he was going to university over there. I remember he got his PhD, I think he was 20 or 21, one of those types, in science now, in organic chemistry. He was an organic chemist. And he did research with the big shots and all that. And so he's very brilliant. But because his parents come from, they're Galicianers, actually. You understand? No, I mean it. So because of that, it's a very Jewish side. And of course, in 1932-33, Hitler comes to power, and he really is a Jewish side. He gets the heck out of Germany, goes to London, eventually to the Weizmann Institute. Chaim Weizmann gets a hold of him, and it's exactly what he's looking for, a very bright, young guy who's very science-oriented and could be a big deal in Jewish science in the future. And he's a macher at the Weizmann Institute, which they thought would, that time they called it the Sif Institute, which will be the headquarters for Israeli science one day when we'll have a state, and so forth. And the war and the Holocaust everything impact him very heavily as it ought to, okay? And he's the type of person, if you're in the academic world, he's a real kachlev. He runs around to all the conferences. He knows everybody. He's a name dropper. He goes here and there, goes around the world. Like Forrest Gump, he met Einstein over here. He met Oppenheimer over there. And that's just true, He met this Norwegian big chemist guy over here once at a meeting in Amsterdam, and met another guy over there. So he's got a lot of, strings running through his hands and all the rest of it. And he's a passionate Zionist, okay? And he sees the future of Israel in the scientific progress. Let's put it this way. What chance does Israel have when it's a few Jews against a sea of Arabs stuck in a bad neighborhood? Like I showed you last week. We're not in the Midwest. We're in the Mideast. How's Israel going to make it? How do you factor for this huge disparity in population, for one thing, between Israel and its mortal enemies? The answer is science. See, a religious person says faith, God. A scientist says science, right? And he meant that we'll have a qualitative superiority. We just have to work real hard to keep ourselves a generation ahead of the Arabs when it comes to science and that sort of thing. The real science, they'll always be, second raters. We should be the first raters. And therefore, we'll be able to triumph in that way. And Israel's a poor country, but we'll find minerals there, and we'll find natural gas off the coast, and things of this nature. You get what I'm saying? It's a certain vision. This is very much the Ben Gurion vision, what I just said before. That maybe originally they thought they'll have 6 million Jews to populate the country, but after the Holocaust they saw that's not going to happen. And so how do we make up for that? Make up through scientific progress. Science is amazing. It's unlimited. The possibilities are there. We just have to make sure that we nurture our scientific advantage, and that can do everything. And he talked very big. I found a very rare piece on the YouTube, and he talks and talks and talks and talks. So I just did a piece of it Huntley Brinkley, remember that? Huntley made it. This is America of 1958. This is something. It's a different media environment, as I mentioned last week. In those days, we were the good guys. The Arabs basically didn't exist. Okay, and so NBC News did a special, Israel 10 years. Now today they've been concentrating on all the bad things that Israel's doing as an understatement, and such subjects as chicken salad. But at that time, I wish I had the time to show you an extended piece of this, which I don't, in which he's talking in rapturous terms. This is Israel's not just a state; it's an ideal. It's a this. He's talking very big over there. And one of the things he does is he has an interview with Ernst David Bergman, who's like the head or one of the heads of the Weizmann Institute. What are the possibilities over there? And I'll just to give you a feel, as only a video can do, of who this guy is. So take a look at the following.
The real importance of Israel's 10th anniversary is that there is one. From our driver to the Army Chief of Staff, Israelis told me they hoped Americans wouldn't fuss too much about the anniversary. Israelis are bored by talk that 10 years ago there seemed no logical nor practical reason to expect this little bit of a country to survive. They had no doubts, and not having doubted then, they see no reason for wonder now. They see no reason because they are themselves the reason. They're also the subject of this report. Other subjects already adequately treated are left out. The continuing war with the Arabs, the lopsided economy, the practical and moral problem of the Arab refugees, the religious questions, the political questions, the diplomatic questions. Important as these matters are, they seem less so than the people themselves. Humanity has been the country's chief resource over the last 10 years, and will be for the next 10, and as far beyond as the mind can imagine. The very proclamation of a free, independent republic, May 10th, 1948, had written into it the principle that any Jew from any land could demand admission as a matter of right. The immigration of hundreds of thousands has been Israel's biggest problem and her first asset. The problem has been to absorb and unite people coming in great numbers from a staggering diversity of backgrounds, of culture, in fact, of civilization. The asset has been the people themselves, from the most sophisticated nuclear physicist born and educated in Berlin to the primitive, unlettered youth brought up in a cave in Morocco, arriving ignorant of Hebrew, illiterate in his native Arabic, and unused to such amenities as telephones, newspapers, and running water. Israel's chief instrument for unifying this diversity is the Army, military service. It teaches Hebrew and how to read and write and make a bed. A young man from Yemen who once knew no faster transportation than a camel comes out of service, an airplane mechanic. The country has one other important means of unification, public attitude. Israeli children are taught that the newcomers, even the impoverished primitive ones, are not their inferiors, but their trust. The word used is not immigration, but ingathering, itself a symbol of men, many long dead, who fashioned an impractical idea and saw it through to fruition by the sheer weight of human will. A few of them lived to see the state founded. Among these, Chaim Weizmann, doctor of chemistry. For 50 years, famed for his chemical substitutes for scarce raw materials. In his last years, when he was Israel's first president, he said, "We have the best of all raw materials, a good population." Now his study is kept as he kept it in 1952, the year he died. The pages of the daybook of that year are still turned. "35 years before, Britain declared to him it would give the Jews a home in Palestine. Foreign Secretary Balfour's declaration, the political genesis of the new Israel, and reportedly what Weizmann asked for when Lloyd George offered him Britain's reward for his war-winning chemical discoveries. This is the legend, but Weizmann later told Churchill, "I wish it had been that simple, without the heartbreaks, but history doesn't deal in Aladdin's lamps." Churchill and General Smuts were godfathers of Zionism, personal friends and political counselors of Weizmann. Another friend, but no Zionist in those years, was Albert Einstein.
You're quite correct. That's it. That's what we call it. And what kind of market is there throughout the world for this product you fashion here?
Well, this stuff is used mostly by pure scientists. And as such, of course, the amount is not in tons, but in grams or kilograms at most.
Yes.
We use half of it ourselves, and the rest we supply to whoever needs it in all parts of the world.
But isn't it true that about 90% of the world's supply is made right here?
That's right. That's about it. Yes.
If you want, you can. Not to be funny, you can find this online. It's the only thing out there where he's speaking, and as you see, he's got a big mouth. He talks about finding uranium in the net. This is part of our story over here. You wouldn't have thought in the Negev they'll find pieces of uranium, but then there's uranium and there's uranium. I have to watch myself very carefully tonight because I'm going to be talking about subjects involving science, which I don't have the faintest idea what I'm speaking about, right? But that's never stopped me before. You want to know something? This guy was talking about uranium in 1947. That is before the state of Israel was even declared. He was in London speaking to scientists that he knew. I told you he's a cock level. He met that he knew a guy that was working on the Manhattan Project, this, that, and the other. He said, what are the chances of us finding uranium in Israel and then one day using it to make a bomb and all that? So you had a couple of either eccentric or extremely visionary individuals at the top of the Israeli pile. Ben Gurion and Bergman think alike. One day the Arabs will gang up and overwhelm us, unless. See? Now, they don't have to articulate it, but there's no question that that's where they're coming from. Both of them see Israel not as a poor third world country. We are a first world country, temporarily down and out. Okay? That's Israel's self-image, certainly in Ben Gurion's time, right? We are just like America and England, something else. For historical reasons, we're stuck here, in the rut. But overall, we're actually give us a chance, and we'll be better than America. You get it? And certainly, when it comes to brain power, science is definitely the road to first world status. That's how they see it. And so Ben Gurion was the type of person who says, "Give me 10 years, give me 20 years from now, Israel will be more advanced than America." He wasn't right about that, but on the other hand, it's probably good to have that kind of a feeling if you're running a country. He wasn't crazy. He was dreaming of what? Of this, right? The Israel of today, in which we call the startup nation, of course, in which they're doing all kinds of technological breakthroughs all the time. You don't need me to tell you all this. You see it in propaganda things. So both Ben Gurion and Bergman have unlimited faith in what they call Hamocha Yehudi, the Jewish mind, and the Jewish pocketbook. And that's just an interesting take on it. And both of them want Israel to get an A-bomb, an atomic bomb, as soon as possible, literally. In order to do this, Israel will need to create a Manhattan Project, which is beyond their means. So alternative means have to be devised. But what? So their survey of the situation led them France. As I talked about last year, Israel and France had a very interesting relationship in the 1950s. France has a big chip on the shoulder, and it was the Fourth Republic which had even a bigger chip on the shoulder. France is recovering from the battles and leadership. Which is the real France? Marshal Pétain, who gave in to the Nazis, de Gaulle, who helped kick out the Nazis, but then wanted to take over as an authoritarian leader himself. And then both of them were thrown out by the politicians of the Fourth Republic. And the Fourth Republic is what we call France from 1945 to 1958, as we'll see. And Fourth Republic, very boring, okay? The great leader over here, let's take a look at the next one, was the foreign minister, Maury Schumann. You never even heard of him. That's my point, okay? You got it? There's the meeting of the foreign ministers. And this old guy over here, with the Barney Google glasses, that's Maurice Schumann, who helped start the NATO and helped start the European, the European Common Market and all kind of things like that. No, he did very important things. Very boring, There's not getting the French out of their rut that things are not going well, even though the Fourth Republic did get a lot done. You get it? But on the other hand, in, let's see now, in 13 years, they had 25 governments. You understand? So it means every 15, it's like the Third Republic. Every 2-3 months, there's a cabinet crisis, the government falls, they have to reshuffle it. It was the opposite of stability. And in the 50s, and I'm talking about France is going through some profound problems in Indochina, in which they get totally defeated eventually. They get problems in Algeria, which eventually they get totally defeated later in the early 60s. It's a country run on proportional representation, which means every party can run for office, and therefore the French Republic has 10, 15, 20, 30 parties running all the time, so nobody can ever get a real majority. No party ever won 51% of the vote, like Israel, and it was a real mess. And not only that, but the French realized, although they hated this, that they had a tradition of losers, correct? You say today the French army, people laugh, which is not really fair, because if you know the French military history, it's quite glorious. The French have won many, many more battles than they've lost over the course of history. But Hitler busted them in 5 minutes, and ever since then they look like a bunch of fools. And in World War II, they were held to be a bunch of fools. Roosevelt, let's put it this way, cut him out of the Manhattan Project. Okay? Roosevelt and Churchill got together and he says, it's American scientists, it's British scientists, it's Canadian scientists, French, not really. You understand? Because after all, they figure, French, the French. And and by the way, the one big there were a few, but very few. The one big exception was a French Jew. Okay, Bertrand Goldschmidt. Okay, who's the Albert Einstein of French physics. And but it's a great story because the Manhattan Project was run by General Groves. If you know anything about the Oppenheimer story, some of you may possibly know this. Basically, when America got into World War II, Roosevelt said, mega bomb. And how you do that? So he said, well, get somebody to organize, put a guy in charge. And so they got the Army's #1 engineer, General Leslie Groves. He's a real guy. And, no, well, hear me out. So he said he wanted to make this an American project. No foreigners, no this, that, the other. White Anglo-Saxon, Americans. Weren't any. There was very few. And he goes around the country in 1942. He goes to Princeton, he goes to Chicago, he goes to Harvard, this and that, and he keeps running into Jews, And not entirely, but a whole lot of them. You get it? And after a while, he says, what's going on over here? And they talk science in a way that's way beyond him, because he was an engineer. He was the Army's top engineer. He wasn't a fool. But science is not his thing. And eventually, he runs into Oppenheimer in California, and Oppenheimer talks down to him, so I'll explain this in a dumbbell way. So, I like you, So that's what happens. So the war turns out to be, the Manhattan Project is put together by this guy and this guy, even though he says, I don't like him, he's a Jew, he's got left-wing politics, but he explains the bomb in a way that I can understand it, and so on and so forth. So these are the guys that put together, as I say, the great Manhattan Projects in Los Alamos and all these other places, and who gets on there? Well, they both have to agree, it has to be. So Oppenheimer says, you should let this guy Goldschmidt on, even though he's French. And so Groves said, okay, Roosevelt finds that. He said, what do you put a Frenchman on there? Right? And General Groves said, he's not French, he's Jewish. He said, okay. So, life is strange. Now, the war's over. Is France a great power? They want to be. That's their tradition. They can't live without that. I mean, why can't France be Switzerland? They can't be Switzerland, right? So after 1952, France feels like a dummy. England has the bomb, America, Russia, France is the one that doesn't. And the others saying, well, the French, naturally, they don't have the bomb. So it really it hurts their self-pride. There's a lot of internal dissension in France over the question whether France should pursue a bomb. There are a lot of idealists and others who say that weapons of mass destruction are not something that will go compatible with the French culture of high ideals and all the rest of it. You can understand that. Look, there's also going to be, in the 1950s, a tremendous amount of internal dissension in the state of Israel, among the elites, A lot of army officers and scientists say weapons of mass destruction is not the way for a Jewish state which represents Jewish ideals. There should be life affirming. That's not the way to go. And the state of Israel should not be associated with bad things. We should also be associated with good things. The 1950s is a decade in which the Jews are associated most famously with good science. Okay, who's the most famous good scientist in 1950? Dr. Salk. Take a look at this.
Washington, and at a White House ceremony, Dr. Jonas Salk, watched proudly by his wife, receives from President Eisenhower a citation for extraordinary achievement following his discovery of a poliomyelitis vaccine.
Before I hand you this citation, I should like to say to you that when I think of the countless thousands of American parents and grandparents who are hereafter to be spared the agonizing fears of the annual epidemic of poliomyelitis, when I think of all the agony that these people will be spared as they see loved ones suffering in bed, I must say to you, I have no words in which adequately to express the thanks of myself, all the people I know, and all 164 million Americans, to say nothing of all the other people in the world that will profit from your discovery. I am very, very happy to hand that to you.
Ben Gurion was asked about it. He says, why can't we do like this? He said, Ani mod marich Dr. Salk, aber nachnu garim b'mizrach tichon, you know? He said, I like Dr. Salk very much, but we live in the Middle East, like Humphrey said last week. He says, you know, I hope Israel produces a cure for cancer, but meanwhile, we need the other thing too. You see? Now, Bergman, as I told you, was a butterfly, went all over the world. Here he is, meeting with Dr. Oppenheimer, you know, and whenever he talked there, he always tried to, you know, crick a rhyme from them in his way, what's doing with the bomb, and all this sort of thing. And, but he knows everybody in the world of science. In 1949 to 52, in the very first years of Israel and France danced a minuet together. You know, they played around. France was very jealous that the others are having all this nuclear research. The French did not have the top scientists. Israel had some very top scientists, even at that early stage, who could help them. And that's what they did. So the French said, we welcome certain Israeli scientists, Mr. Shalit and others, physicists and whatever it is, to come and work with us on our projects. They weren't talking about making a French bomb yet, but if you get in with a real country like France, if you get in from the bottom, maybe you'll be there when they go to the top. So already in 1950, 51, and all that sort of thing, as I said, each one, Israel can offer them scientists, the French can offer them a place for scientists to do some big research in a way that a small country like Israel cannot do so. France has universities with physics departments. It's basically what we call in Hebrew, shimush, right? It's the opportunity, like somebody goes to study with a great rabbi and get discipleship, hands-on experience. So that's what happened over here. And a certain shutfus, a certain partnership, you might say, even though it's a big partner versus a small partner, ensues, fueled heavily by French feelings about the Holocaust. Meaning, the French let the Jews in, partly Israeli scientists, partly because they need them, and partly because this is the early 50s, there's still enough feeling bad about the Holocaust that the Jews are treated special. Israel had a special place in French hearts if somebody knew how to fan that flame. If you recall last year, the French commander and defense minister was the French General Pierre Koenig, with Arie Levin, meaning the top French military officials, all the rest, they look at Israel as something miyuchad, something special, even though France is always a very selfish kind of country, but they dropped that a little bit in the period that I'm talking about, and the result is that you have a very interesting symbiosis kind of developing over there. Ben Gurion and Shimon Peres were able to play that fiddle very well. That's what I can tell you. You have to understand, the Europeans are funny in the following regard. They don't believe in religion exactly anymore in the modern era, but they do believe in the state. If you will ask French people, he said, do you feel bad that France handed over Jews who were of German origin or of Polish origin? Nah, the heck with them. But they handed over, the French did, in World War II, they handed over French Jews who were French citizens. That's a violation of the oath, you understand? A citizen of France is supposed to be protected against. That's how they feel in Sweden. That's how they feel in Germany, frankly, and in other countries. Our own citizens, we shouldn't have given over to the Germans. And they have a bad conscience about that until today, because like breaking the bonds of modernity. And so a lot of this was still around at that time. The key thing in Israel is secrecy. Just don't talk about this with anybody. Now, it's the Ben Gurion era. And in the Ben Gurion era, you had secrecy. He owned the media, as I told you last week. That is to say, he owned, literally, the radio. It was under him. And he owned a bunch of newspapers. And the other newspapers were still, who didn't go with him, and he certainly had opposition newspapers. I'll give you an example, Cherut from the Menachem Begin. Even the opposition newspapers, for the most part, were willing to go along with the kind of feeling that once upon a time hit in Israel, which is, listen, it's only a few years since the Holocaust. The Arabs are out to cut our throats, so we can argue among ourselves there, but not in matters of bitachon, right? Don't talk about what you do in the army. Don't talk about, if you go to a party, don't talk about what you do. Secrecy is a big deal, and Ben Gurion is like the epitome, you might say, of that notion of secrecy, which is still there to some degree in Israel, but not what it was, okay? Not what it was. In 1952, Ben Gurion secretly sets up the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission headed by Professor Bergman. Israel, the little Pisher state, it's a Rolls Royce, atomic energy. Israel, 1952, they literally can't feed themselves. They're depending on ships of food coming from America. Atomic Energy Commission, what's happens? You see, both are characteristic. First of all, we're a first world state just down and out at the moment, but it's secret. Nobody knows about the existence of the Atomic Energy Commission. You're not supposed to talk about it. Many in Israel opposed the idea of the bomb, as I told you before. Now that means there was secret opposition. Get it? People, no. Behind closed doors or in private letters to Ben Gurion and the other officials, they would say this is a bad idea. But they would never leak. They would not go to CBS News or something like that, because you don't do that in the Ben Gurion period. These guys wanted peaceful research. The Eisenhower administration, that comes in 1953, thought about what to do with the atomic stuff, and they came up with the idea of atoms for peace, which is that, as you know, not everything about nuclear research is about bombs. A lot of it is about getting energy. As a matter of fact, if you do it right, you don't need the, the oil, correct? The only problem is you get Chernobyl if you don't, in 3 Mile Island, if you don't know what you're doing. So that's the problem. But at that time especially, it all seemed like a great idea. And Eisenhower gave a speech in 1955 saying any country that wants to study atomic stuff for peaceful research purposes and help their science and help their economy and things like that, America will cooperate with them. And Israel, by the way, was one of the countries that signed up. And in 1957, they got their reactor. Now, that means it's under American control. All the waste products they could possibly use for weapons are given to American, given back to America. It's, after all, you don't want it for weapons. You want it for, studying and learning more about nuclear physics and things of that nature. And Israel definitely wanted to do that, among other things. But that's, of course, not all they wanted to do. So Nachal Sorek is the place where they have the peaceful nuclear reactor. You get it? It's still there. But when all is said and done, even though a lot of people, I would say the decisive majority, this is just an interesting story I'm about to tell you, the decisive majority, 3/4 of the scientists in Israel, the generals in Israel, the big shots who made the opinions, maybe even 80% were absolutely opposed to Israel pursuing military nuclear research. It didn't matter because Ben Gurion said, I'm the only person that counts, and I say we do it. So this is like Abraham Lincoln famously, where he took a vote in the cabinet, and he voted one way, the whole cabinet voted another way. He says it's 9-1, one wins, And in his time, he had that kind of authority in the 50s. The others backed off. They said, we think you're doing something big, but Ben Gurion says, oh, okay, This is that one person, Ben Gurion, appoints the one person who cares only about what the one person wants. And I'm, of course, talking about this guy. Well, I thought I was anyway. Shimon Peres. Okay, there we go. All right. Shimon Peres was 29 years old when Ben-Gurion made him the head of the defense ministry. Defense ministry is the most powerful ministry in Israel. They have the largest, in the 50s, they have the largest number of employees. They get priority and everything like this. And there's a 29, 30-year-old guy, young fellow, who Ben-Gurion puts him in there because very energetic and very intelligent, very active. Never went to college. And he wants to do what Ben-Gurion wants, you understand? And he'll move heaven and earth to do it. And this is the 50s, which is the golden years, if you want to call it that, or the opposite, depending on your political point of view, of the Ben-Gurion-Peres relationship. And when Ben-Gurion lays these broad visions, and he tells Peres, you go do it, and Peres does it. It's good, and he goes sneaky, and behind doors, and do this, and do that, and the smuggling, and whatever, but he gets it done. Peres certainly catches the Ben-Gurion-Bergman bug. And then, we want a bomb. They never use the words, but they always say we want the big project and all that kind of stuff. If you will recall, from last year, Shimon Peres made it his business to craft a unique Israel-France relationship. He went there 1,000 times. I mean, he was on the plane every week, and sometimes more than that. He went to Paris, and he talked to everybody, every single official in the defense ministry, and the foreign ministry, and the parliament, and the media, and the this, and the that. And, you got to give him credit. 3/4 of the time, people close the door in their face and say, go to the devil, but 1/4 of the time, they do not. Understand? If you're willing to do that, so you're willing to take 9 rejections to get 1 acceptance, after a while, you'll build up a little bit of a group. And that is what he did. He was indefatigable, and he, little by little, built up a relationship in which France was the only country to start selling Israel weapons, like airplanes and tanks and things like that. The tanks were no good, but the airplanes were good. And nobody else would give him any weapons. You get it? Meanwhile, Russia was giving Nasser a lot of weapons. So it's no joke what I'm talking about over here. And little by little, subtly, he moves his way to France giving them, or as he starts talking about France maybe giving Israel a nuclear power plant. Okay? There's Peres with one of his closest friends. Bourges Monnery was the defense minister and later became the prime minister. There are like 2 dozen guys like this that he befriended and stayed friends to the rest of his life. On which Peres is quite a guy when he puts his mind to it. And he built up his whole network in France. Now, remember, at the time I'm talking about, in the middle 50s, France not only did not have an A-bomb, they had not decided they wanted to. The head of French physics was this famous guy over here, François Perrin, and he was always going back and forth over what the direction of French physics should be and, which way should they go. But little by little, they do decide, and when you have the famous elections of 1956, when the Socialist Party comes in, we can move to the next one. When the Socialist Party comes in and Guy Mollet becomes the prime minister, France is already under a lot of trouble from Algeria, and they're being pushed around by the other great powers. And what I can tell you is that without them ever saying it, sort of like Israel, they moved in the direction of research toward a bomb. And that is in 56. Guy Mollet was the head of the Socialist Party. Israel, the Mapai, Ben-Gurion is a socialist. He felt a socialist with brotherhood with Israel, as well as the concern for another Holocaust. And you will recall from last year that the French-Israeli relationship got close enough that they joined together in a war against Egypt called the Sinai Campaign. That was the culmination of the process I'm talking about, is they literally went to war together. And when they went to war, the French gave the Israelis a bunch of airplanes before it happened, and other recoilless rifles and all kind of weapon systems, and it did happen. Now, when they went to war, France and England promised Israel secretly that they'll protect, let's put it this way, they'll protect Israel from any negative reaction from the UN or the United States or that sort of thing. But they couldn't. First of all, if you know who the French and the British are, don't believe any promise. But the Israelis did, and of course, when push came to shove, and Eisenhower said, get out, and Khrushchev, most importantly, Khrushchev said, if you recall this, he said, if you don't pull out, we'll nuke you. Okay? He basically threatened them with nuclear bombs. Now, Eisenhower had a CIA report which said the Russians can't do it, they're bluffing. But if you're in Paris and you're in London, what if they're wrong, And so they had to back out. Khrushchev threatened Israel with nuking them. He wrote a letter to Ben-Gurion which says, why is Israel engaging behavior which can endanger the very existence of the state. So what does that mean? What does that mean? And so all three got spooked, and a number of results emerged from this. One is that the French said, "The heck with this, we're getting our bombs so the Russians can't do that to us again." Okay? That is what, this is the unintended consequences. He pushed the French responded. They did get out of Sinai, but said, "We're getting an A-bomb," right? Because of what the Russians did to us. Ben Gurion, of course, was going to do it anyway, but he could say, "Oh, see what happens when you don't have an A-bomb?" And Shimon Peres, very cleverly, he was able to discern that when the French saw that they couldn't save Israel as they promised to from the pressure from the outside, that the French felt bad. And Molay, the Prime Minister of France, said to Shimon Peres, "Oh, I feel so bad. We promised you this. France likes to keep its word. I can't imagine how we can we let you down." And Shimon Peres says, "I have an idea or two how this could be made right." We could discuss it, right? And I want to tell you something. He kind of said, without ever using the words, he said, if France would help Israel, just like France was to make sure that it'll never be subjected to Soviet nuclear threats again, Israel thinking along the same lines. Of course, we don't want to go all the way, chas v'shalom, but we would appreciate significant French help in this project, like that, And Guy Mollet, the Prime Minister of France, he says, "We have to make this up to Israel. We have to do this." And as I say before, you can really thank Khrushchev for being part of this whole process. But within a short time, Mollet fell from power. I told you it's the Fourth Republic. They're the only prime ministers for relatively short time. But there's a new guy after Mollet. What's going to happen with him? Not to worry. The new guy is Peres' best friend, right? Maurice Bush-Monore. And it's an aristocratic family, all the rest of it. And Bush said like this, "We'll help you." And he does, by the way. In 1957, he helps Peres, who plays an extraordinary insider role in French politics, as the Fourth Republic is crumbling due to the Algerian situation. So if I told this in detail, it'd be a movie. Shimon Peres, he sat in on the cabinet meetings of the French government. He goes to, the kind of infiltration, if I can use that word, of Israelis into the innermost sancta of the French authorities. They're working in their most secret laboratories. The Israeli generals and colonels are sitting on the top French national security army meetings. It's just crazy, you understand? Because Peres, and it really is to him, Peres created an atmosphere which Israel's different. They're just Israeli. That's a different story. They're on our side anyway, and Israel's different, right? It's incredible. And in order to get the French cabinet to sign a formal agreement that they're going to help Israel on the nuclear plant issue, Shimon Peres, he went to this minister, he went to this minister, and he went to each minister separately, and when someone said no, he went to the chief of staff of the minister and got to him. He worked incredibly hard and incredibly skillfully, and the cabinet was having a crisis, and it's a remarkable story. The cabinet was having a crisis, and eventually they fell, as is common in the Fourth Republic, and they were supposed to have that vote where they're going to agree officially as the French government, while they still are, to give Israel this contract, but the cabinet has just fallen, and Peres shows up in the cabinet meeting, he says something along the lines, "Can we do like they do in the Maryland legislature? Can we turn the clock back officially and, delay your resignation for like an hour, and meanwhile vote on this and sign it so I can take this with me?" And they do. They do. He says, because Israel is different, something like that. And Peres says, "Got it," And so it's incredible. This is happening as the Fourth Republic goes into major crisis and dissolves. What happened in France is that they totally lost the Indochina War, the Vietnam War, but then they had the problem with the Algerians. And what do you do with that? And the Algerian population, the Muslims, resorted to big-time terrorism, like not exactly, but something along the lines of what Israel is going through today. And what do you do about that? You see? And the army wanted to kill everybody, but the politicians said no. But then the politicians said do this, and the army said no. And it's a crisis. And the result is that, let's see over here. This General Massu, who was the George Patton, you might say, of the French army, he said, Charles de Gaulle looked at him and he says, "Massu, are you still stupid?" He says, "Always a loyal Gaullist." This guy said like this: I'm going to take my army. We're going to go to Paris, overthrow the government. We're going to take over the city. You see, because I can't stand these lousy politicians. It's like 7 days in May. They're really going to do it. The only way they won't do it, put Charles de Gaulle as the dictator of France, or the head of the government. De Gaulle was the famous general from World War II, but he'd been out of office since 1946. He tried to be prime minister of France, and then he found they wouldn't listen to him in the parliament, so he said, I quit. And he was very ostentatiously in exile in his country estate, making himself like a Ben Gurion figure. He's the Solon, the wise man that they all look to. And he was waiting to be called to be France's savior. And it worked. He just had to wait 13 years, but it worked. And the army says this, the politicians get scared of the Fourth Republic, and they say, we agree. And they appoint de Gaulle to be the prime minister in the Fourth Republic, and de Gaulle says, I agree, but only if you give me permission to change the Constitution and create something called the Fifth Republic, in which you'll have a presidential system. So we'll have a strong guy in the center. Enough of this government changing every 10 minutes. I can't stand it. France needs much greater political stability, and we need a president who's elected for a 7-year term, not a 4-year term. And the president should have a lot of power. And they agreed, and that's the government you have in France till today. From 1958 until today, 59, is called the Fifth Republic. And so it is democratic. They do have elections, but whoever wins, if you're in the presidency, you have a lot more power than the president of the United States. Okay? The president can dissolve parliament whenever he wants. It's quite a system over there. And the point, though, is right in the middle of all the Paris machinations, the French, the Chalerias, they changed on you. They switched to a new system, and now everything is dependent on Charles de Gaulle, right? How is he with the Jews? You get it? Now here's de Gaulle at the Shoah monument in France. Very de Gaulle-like picture, right? You get it? Standing over there. And this is a monument to the 6 million in France. And the reason I share this with you is to say Charles de Gaulle is a very, very interesting person, and no one's figured him out 100% till today. And when it comes to the Jews, there was a famous book by Raymond Aron, if anybody remembers this, in the late 60s, called De Gaulle and the Jews. And he was from a very conservative Catholic army background, career officer and all that sort of thing. But, life expanded him somewhat. And when he went through the process of World War II, as you all know, I assume you all know, de Gaulle ran away to England and fought from there. So most of the people that rallied to his side, the resistance, or I shouldn't say most, that's not true, but many, Jewish. Get it? And he saw that the Jews are a positive element if used properly. Let's put it that way. And that a lot of Jews are not communists. Many are, but many are not. And they could be de Gaulle freaks, you understand? And overall, I would say beyond that, de Gaulle was a person of the mid-20th century, and he said the Holocaust was a bad thing. And as I said before, France really did an Avera by allowing French citizens to be rounded up and handed up by the French. You understand what happened to France? The French police rounded up the French Jews and handed them over to the Gestapo, right? To the SS. That's a real violation of Frenchkeit, okay? And it bothered him also. Consequently, he's a conflicted person. He doesn't exactly like Israel, but on the other hand, he kind of admires them, and the Jews are a little strange, you know what I mean? But on the other hand, the Jews have been really shafted, and which way will it go? And it's a very complicated question. But at the time I'm speaking of, when he becomes the head of France in 1958, he is sympathetic to the Jews. He's sympathetic to the state of Israel, but he's a super French nationalist. He's French, which is understandable. And there occurs a famous, unfortunate incident where he goes to the place where they're doing all the nuclear research to give a speech, and in the presidential limousine. And he sees all the cars parked in the parking lot, and they all have blue plates, you understand, which are French license plates. And he sees one car over there with like yellow plates. This was a big disaster. He said, what the heck is the yellow plates over there? He says, that's this guy, the Israeli scientist, Amos Israeli. He's in the middle of the top secret thing. Oh, he's Israeli, it's okay, don't worry about it. Paul said, the heck with that, Like, who came up with that? That's how we always run the program. No, I don't approve of that at all. You see, that would bother him. So if Amos the Shalit had only gotten a French license plate, we would have spared all this trouble. You understand? Now, here comes the story, which is very fascinating from the point of view of the student of bureaucracy. Because de Gaulle comes back from that speech and immediately orders as he puts it, the uniquely incestuous relations with Israel to be ended. Okay? You know, I don't say we declare war on Israel, but they shouldn't be in the top secret places and all that, like all that. It doesn't happen. Because de Gaulle is the president at the top. But it all depends on the bureaucrats in the middle. Is that true? President Obama can say whatever he wants. It's what the guys do in the daily office. I know we have federal workers here, so I'll say no more on the subject. But the fact is that de Gaulle appoints, foreign minister, defense minister, his own government. The guy put in charge of atomic bomb projects and the whole nuclear business is the number one friend of Israel, Jacques Cousteau. Just happened to be coincidentally. Jacques Cousteau was a right-wing Gaullist who was anti-Algerian and all that sort of thing, a very big French nationalist. Jacques Cousteau was bit by Shimon Peres. He got Israel rabies, you understand? And he actually wrote a book about Israel called Israel's Heroic Long March or something like that, And so Jacques Cousteau saw like this, oui, mon général, he says to Israel, don't worry about it, keep it up. You see? And this is a funny situation over here. De Gaulle is not comfortable with Israel's acquiring nuclear plants, but it will happen anyway. That's the point. Because it's not a dictatorship exactly, and with the government has to have a lot of energy to really want to do something. I mean, if de Gaulle would say, I want this stop now, and I'm talking to this guy and the undersecretary of this and the head of the committee and this and that, if you really go for it, but he doesn't have that kind of energy usually. You understand? And so the fact is that we're 1958 and 57, 58, and Israel signs contracts with all these French companies who come and build secret huge plants in Dimona. That's how it happened. Where's a place? Shimon Peres made a committee. They figured out Dimona. And all of a sudden, in 1958, a ton of Frenchmen show up in Beersheba. They're given special apartments. Israel builds these 7-room apartments. They give them to them for condos for free and all this kind of. Next thing you know, as they got into the project, shh, don't tell anybody. You understand? And the Shin Bet is in charge, and the French Secret Service is in charge, and the employees write letters back to home. No, they don't. They write it to Argentina, and from Argentina they send it to France. You get it? No, they take all these kind of issues over here to keep the secrecy going. The workers are really shafted. This is, after all, the Ben Gurion era, like Salah Shabati. They hire, who does the heavy work? They Sephardim, the new immigrants. They do all the pushing and shoving. But Peres is doing all this, as we'll see, off a budget, and so he wants to save money. And so in Israel, if you're hired for 2 months, then you get your benefits. So they hire all these workers for 59 days, and then they fire them, and then 2-3 days later they hire them again. And what can I tell you? This Ben Gurion period has many characteristics. One of them is the golden age of Jewish racism, I'm sorry to say. Or perhaps I should say the dark ages of Jewish racism. It is what it is. And this story is part of that, you see? So we can't hide over that either. I know nobody wishes to. It cost millions. In fact, I'm wrong. It cost tens of millions in 1958. That's when $1 million was real money. Tens of millions. Kesef Minolan, the guys in charge of Israel's economy, Levi Eshkol, who's the finance minister, and Pinchas Sapir is in charge of the commerce. He said, where we got this kind of money? I'm trying to get money to build a road. I'm trying to get money to build a couple of apartments. I mean that, We have immigrants. Remember the figures I showed you last week? We have 20, 30, 40,000 people coming from Morocco. Where are we going to get this kind of money? Kicha, Mr. Efron, right? Ben Gurion and Shimon Peres like this, we'll get on the side. Yeah, we go to him, no, get off the books. They go around to, in other words, it's a remarkable story. Ben Gurion and Shimon Peres privately went around the world in the Rolodex, and they brought to Israel, and they met with all the big millionaires. You understand? I know in Baltimore, I went to Joe Meyerhoff, for example. They went to all the millionaires, and they said like this, like General Marshall said, we need $1 million and shut up, don't ask where it's going for. You understand? And that's it. And, all these guys said like this, I get it, And he raised 40 million, 50, 60 million, incredible amounts of money. Not that it was enough, but incredible amounts of money. After a while, Jews being Jews, so Peres sort of let it go. And I know by the 60s, he was always taking people who want to see the secret plan. Don't show it. No, it really is true. He got this Max Fisher and guys like that. You want to see the secret plan, But, well, come on. I mean, it's an extra $1 million, But we Jews are Jews, we can't help it. Now, this Abe Feinberg, Rothschild, you probably heard of, but or at least you heard of the Rothschilds. But Feinberg, a very interesting. I spoke about it in the past. Abe Feinberg. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to spend the remainder of my time tonight speaking primarily about two Jews, and one of them is Abe Feinberg. The other one is someone else. And Abe Feinberg, you can tell by the name, is a New York Jewish boy whose father made hosiery, and in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and they did well. They prospered. And by the time World War II comes around, you can imagine what kind of contracts they got in World War II, They did well. And so he, like some people we know, said, I'd like to take my money and translate into political influence. I know it's not often heard of, right? It certainly never happens in Baltimore, Maryland, but, but he wanted to be the type of person the President of the United States would come to his house on Erev Shabbos. That's exactly what he wanted to be. And there's... And I mean it when I say that he really meant it l'shem shamayim, and this is really true. He was a Jewish Jew. I say this in the best sense of the word. He was a Jewish Jew. He cared about Israel. He cared about all the right things, and he was very upfront. He said like this: I like to use the money in the best way to help my people. So by the 40s already, by 41, 42, he was well positioned enough to get himself a draft deferment and all that kind of stuff. And he wanted to get close to FDR. But basically, they said, yes, FDR's taken. He's already got the rich people around him. And so what do you do? He says like this, let me try my luck with the party head. So he gets close to the new head of the Democratic Party, Robert Hannigan from St. Louis. Robert Hannigan is a Democratic politician. Guess what? Politicians need money when they run. I know you ever heard of that before. And so even if it's not the President of the United States, the senators, the congressmen, and all that kind of business, and he can put together, he learns how to do Hilchos fundraising. And Robert Hannigan is the guy that made Truman. Because he was from Missouri, and Roosevelt had to get rid of Henry Wallace, and who should I get next? And Robert Hannigan took the opportunity to push his senator, and that's how Truman got in. And so Abe Feinberg, in 1944, at the time Truman is nominated, got in the inside group with this guy, Harry Truman, that nobody thought will ever be anything because they said Roosevelt will live forever. To everyone's surprise, a few months later, Truman is the President of the United States. And this guy knows him very well. And Truman's a politician, obviously, and politicians need money. I don't say he used it for his own pocket, but they need money to run, for election, congressional elections, other things like that. And Truman was a Democrat, real party line type of thing. He wanted everybody to vote the straight Democratic ticket. And it's just quite a remarkable story. When Truman ran in 48, the famous election, which everybody thought he'd lose, this picture. So one of the reasons they thought he'd lose, he was broke. He used the power of the office to get the nomination, even though the Democratic Party didn't want him to get the nomination in 48. They used to say like this: "To err is Truman." You understand? He was considered a big boob. Nevertheless, he got the nomination, and as you all know, he ran an upset campaign and won the election. This is a famous. How did he do that? Shortly after he got the nomination, then he's like this: "Now we have to talk tachlis. Where do we get the money?" Then Lewis Johnson, a famous guy, was the head of the finance committee, said, we're broke. And this guy showed up at the meeting, Abe Feinberg, and he said like this: what are we talking about? He says, we can't go. Truman made a whole speech. He says, if I was investing, if I had the money, I would invest in me because I'm going to win, So Abe Feinberg says, what are we talking about? $400,000. He said, I can do that. Right? No, go around the country. I can do that. And he did. And once he did that, then Truman was like this: you're the man, okay? As a matter of fact, if you want to get deep down and dirty, the famous, whistle stop campaign that we've all heard about, Truman went around the country saying, damn the Congress, damn the Republicans and all this, give them hell, Harry. How did that train run? Many times they didn't have enough money to pay for the train, and Abe Feinberg arranged for some Jewish businessmen to show up in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, in Omaha, in Denver with cash. You understand? Which wasn't, I'll say it again, it wasn't going for Truman's pocket. He didn't use it for, he left the White House a poor man, but they used it to pay the train. And a famous case, they didn't have money to pay for a radio broadcast and stuff like that. So by the time the election's over, this guy is tight with the White House. Is that true? And in fact, Truman offered to make him ambassador to Israel, but he said it'd be better to have someone not Jewish in the post. And there you have it. So this guy, Feinberg, is good at fundraising. And so he's on Ben-Gurion's Rolodex, and basically it's like this. You have to come up with $1 million, $2 million, $5 million for a certain project that need not be named. Now, you don't have to be totally, you'd have to be pretty stupid in the 1950s to figure out if they have a secret project, what is Israel going to do? They're not buying tefillin, you know, I mean, what could it possibly be? But anyway, so that's how they did it. It's quite a story. Next lecture, you'll see Feinberg was a Democrat, played a very important role in the Dimona story when it comes to JFK and LBJ, okay? Because, and not, Eisenhower was a Republican, these guys were Democrats, he had a lot of power. You may be smirking, but if you take the trouble to read books that have come out now in recent years of the transcripts